The binder on the desk had a coffee stain shaped like a crushed spider, and the fifth rule was underlined twice in red ink. I found it my first afternoon in the tower. The USFS doesn't issue handwritten survival guides, so I knew the previous occupant left it behind. They helicoptered him out a week early because he stopped answering the radio. When the relief crew found him, he was sitting on the floor with his hands clamped over his eyes, refusing to speak. My tower sat 60 feet above a ridge in the middle of nowhere. A vast sea of pine trees stretched in every direction, rolling over valleys and peaks until the green faded into the hazy blue of the horizon. My job was simple. Sit in the glass box, watch for smoke, call it in. I spent the first few hours familiarizing myself with the cramped space. There was a cot, a small kitchenette, a radio console, and the Osborne firefinder mounted on a pedestal in the center. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of absolute isolation. The silence up here was vast. It wrapped around the structure, pressing against the windows. Around sunset, I opened the binder. Most of it was mundane advice. Which floorboards gave way when stepped on? How to jiggle the handle of the stove to keep the pilot lit. But Rule 5 stood out, written in a frantic, jagged script that dug deep into the paper. If you smell burning pitch but see no gray haze in the valley, lock the deadbolt, tie something over your eyes, and do not make a sound until the sun hits your face. I laughed it off. Hazing the new guy. Standard procedure in remote postings. I tossed the binder onto the cot and brewed a pot of coffee as the sky bruised into twilight. Midnight brought a deep, starless dark. I was reading a paperback by the glow of a small desk lamp when the scent arrived. It started faint. A bitter, sharp tang tickling the back of my throat. Scorched sap and smoldering pine needles. I set the book down, my pulse ticking up a fraction. I walked to the east-facing window and cupped my hands around my eyes to block the glare of the lamp. Peering out into the night. No orange glow on the ridges. No plume blocking the stars. The smell grew thicker. It coated my tongue with the taste of ash. My eyes began to water. I moved to the west window, then the north. I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of a blaze. The forest remained a black, unbroken ocean. I picked up the radio microphone, pressing the button to call dispatch. Only a flat, rhythmic hiss came through the speaker. No voices. No dispatcher asking for my coordinates. Just the hollow sound of dead air. Smoke now hung in the room, invisible but choking. I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve. Panic flared in my chest. A localized fire? Was the tower itself burning? I dropped to my knees, feeling the floorboards, searching for heat. The wood was cold. I checked the small propane stove. Off. I checked the wiring under the console. Fine. Yet the smell was suffocating. It smelled like an ancient forest turning to dust, a dry and consuming heat that offered no light. I looked at the binder resting on the cot. Rule 5. My mind spun, trying to apply logic. Downdrafts carrying smoke from hundreds of miles away. A bizarre localized weather phenomenon trapping old soot. But the sheer intensity of the odor defied reason. It felt deliberate. My lungs burned. My eyes streamed tears. I stumbled toward the door, my fingers fumbling with the brass deadbolt. I slammed it into the locked position. I tore through my duffel bag, pulling out a thick wool scarf. I did not want to put it on. Covering my eyes felt like surrendering to madness. But the acrid scent was clawing at the inside of my nose, and a primal, unreasoning terror took root in my gut. Something was wrong with the air. Something was wrong with the night. I wrapped the scarf tightly around my head, knotting it at the base of my skull. Absolute blackness. I stood in the center of the room, listening. My own breathing sounded loud, ragged. I forced myself to take shallow, quiet breaths. I needed an anchor. Without sight, the small room felt like an endless void. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the cold metal of the firefinder in the center. I used it as my 0 point. I began to pace. 4 steps to the left. The toe of my boot hit the baseboard. I turned. 4 steps back to the center. I repeated this motion, carving a groove into my own mind to stay grounded. The smell was overpowering, a phantom fire trying to smoke me out of my sanctuary. An hour must have passed, maybe 2. Time loses its shape when you cannot see the hands of a clock. Then, the floor shifted. It was subtle at first. A slight groan in the support beams beneath me. I stopped pacing. I stood frozen by the center console. I stood frozen by the center console. I stood frozen by the center console. The wooden planks under my boots tilted, just a fraction of an inch. The tower was leaning. My hands gripped the metal stand of the firefighter. I waited. Another shift. The sensation of immense weight settling onto the exterior catwalk outside the glass. The steel railings vibrated. The structure settled back, the floor leveling out. But the pressure in the room changed. The air grew stagnant. I clamped my jaw shut, refusing to gasp. I remembered the rule. Do not make a sound. Something was outside. I could not see it, but I could feel the displacement of the air. The sheer mass of whatever had climbed the 60 feet of stairs was compressing the wooden beams. The tower swayed, a slow, unnatural pendulum motion that had nothing to do with the wind. I kept the blindfold tight. I focused on the rough texture of the wool against my eyelids. I focused on the smell of the phantom smoke. I refused to let my imagination draw the shape of what stood beyond the glass. More time bled away. The agonizing suspension of waiting in the dark while the structure groaned under an impossible burden. I stayed rooted to the center of the room, my muscles cramping, my throat raw from the invisible ash. Eventually, the pressure lifted. The floorboards leveled out permanently. The bitter scent of scorched earth began to dissipate, replaced by the crisp, thin air of high altitude. I stayed blindfolded. I did not trust the quiet. I stood there until the cold night air warmed, until a dull red glow began to penetrate the thick wool of the scarf. The sun. I reached up with trembling hands and pulled the knot loose. The scarf fell to the floor. Morning light flooded the glass box. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue. The forest below was green and vibrant, untouched by any flame. I let out a long, shuddering exhale. I wiped the dry tears from my face and laughed, a dry, ragged sound. I was alive. I had survived a panic attack, a bizarre sensory hallucination brought on by fatigue and a creepy notebook. Nothing more. I walked to the kitchenette, grabbing a bottle of water. I drank it down greedily, the cool liquid soothing my raw throat. I felt foolish. I felt sane again. I leaned against the glass, looking down at the dirt access road where I had parked my truck the day before. The vehicle sat right where I left it, but the tire tracks leading up the mountain were gone. Instead, a single, continuous 6-foot-wide groove had been dragged through the compacted earth, carving a deep trench through the soil, flattening the brush, and stopping exactly at the wooden stilts of my tower. Working the graveyard shift at Plaza 7 teaches you exactly how many seconds it takes for a person to realize they drove into a closed lane. They always brake too late, stare at the orange barricade, and then reverse with this shameful hesitation. I sit in a reinforced acrylic box and watch them do it. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The highway was a desolate strip of gray concrete cutting through marshland. The fluorescent lights overhead bathed the concrete in a sickly yellow hue. I worked lane 3. Lane 4, directly to my right, was closed. Orange traffic barrels blocked the entrance, and the automated coin basket was covered with a thick black tarp, taped down with duct tape. The heater in my booth was busted, blowing lukewarm air that smelled of old exhaust fumes and stale coffee. I sat on a cracked vinyl stool, staring down the empty turnpike. Isolation does weird things to your perception. You start counting the reflectors on the pavement. You start timing the gaps between long-haul trucks. A shadow moved across the asphalt. I blinked, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Just a cloud passing over the moon. I turned my attention to the sorting machine inside my booth, organizing rolls of quarters to pass the time. Next door, metal struck plastic. I paused. I looked over at lane 4. The booth was dark. The lane was empty. I listened. The wind sweeping across the marsh rattled the overhead signs. I assumed it was just a loose piece of debris hitting the barricade. I went back to my quarters. Metal struck metal. Then again, I stopped breathing. The rhythm was precise. It was the exact, unmistakable cadence of coins dropping into a collection basket. 1 quarter. 2 quarters. a dime, a nickel. I stared through the scratched acrylic of my window into the dark interior of the Lane 4 booth. Nothing but shadows. I told myself it was the internal machinery. Sometimes the automated sorters misfired, clearing old jams from weeks ago. Basic gravity and faulty springs. The coins dropped again. Same sequence. Quarter, quarter, dime, nickel. It perfectly mirrored the cost of a 2-axle toll. I sat absolutely motionless. I did not reach for the phone to call the plaza supervisor. I did not stand up. I kept my hands flat on my counter. Then came the breathing. It was not a gust of wind catching the edges of the booth. It was the wet, ragged drawing of air over damp teeth. It emanated from the darkness of Lane 4, right where a driver would sit in their car. It was loud enough to pierce the thick glass of my enclosure. The breath hitched, a stuttering intake of oxygen, followed by a long, slow exhale that fogged the outside of my window. A patch of condensation bloomed on my side of the acrylic, directly adjacent to my face. I stared straight ahead at the empty highway. If I turned my head, I would have to acknowledge whatever was sitting in the empty lane. I gripped the edges of my counter. The vinyl stool dug into my thighs, my chest tight. I bargained with the situation. I told myself to wait it out. Whatever was out there, whatever anomaly had wandered off the marsh and into the plaza, would get bored. It would move on. I just needed to remain uninteresting. I needed to be a fixture of the booth, no different than the cash register or the broken heater. The wet breathing continued for 10 agonizing minutes. Each inhale sounded like lungs filled with muddy water. Each exhale spread the condensation wider on the glass. I kept my eyes locked on the horizon. I traced the white lines of the highway until they vanished into the dark. Finally, the noise stopped. The patch of fog on the glass began to recede, shrinking back down to nothing. The normal ambient sounds of the turnpike returned. The distant hum of tires miles away. The rustle of dry marsh grass. I released my grip on the counter. My palms were slick with sweat. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. It was gone. The plaza was empty. I convinced myself it was a coyote or a stray dog wandering the lanes, sniffing at the glass. The coin sounds were just my exhausted brain misinterpreting the wind rattling the metal chute. Logic flooded back, a warm and comforting tide. I swiveled my chair away from the window and faced my own register. I needed to do something normal. I needed routine to rebuild my fractured composure. I noticed a red indicator light flashing on my coin dispenser, a jam in the return chute. Standard issue with these old machines. Dirt and grime build up, and a coin gets wedged sideways in the narrow track. I sighed, grateful for the distraction. I grabbed a rag from under the counter and wiped the grease from my hands. I reached down to the metal coin return slot to dislodge the blockage. I curled my index finger, sliding it into the dark, narrow opening of the machine, expecting to flick a cold, rigid piece of silver. But my fingernail scraped against soft, wet ridges of warm skin and the smooth edge of a molar just as the opening clamped down hard on my knuckle. We have a corporate mandate taped to the inside of our gear lockers. It says if you feel 3 sharp impacts against the back of your rig while diving alone, you strike your own helmet twice, kill your lamps, and wait for the tether to pull you up. They do not explain why. They just make you sign a form saying you read it. I repair deep-sea pipelines. It is a job where you exist inside a walking metal coffin. The atmospheric dive suit I wear weighs a ton. It has jointed titanium arms and a thick glass dome for a head. Once the crane drops you off the barge and you sink down into the trench, you are cut off from the sun. The ocean at that depth is just a massive void of crushing black water. My only connection to the world above is a reinforced tether and a radio wire. The task was supposed to be a simple patch job on a cracked flange. The depth was 800 feet. The water outside my dome was a freezing, endless night, pushed back only a few yards by the dual floodlights mounted over my shoulders. Dust and dead things drifted past the beams like underwater snow. I positioned my mechanical arms over the crack. Operating the suit requires pushing against the thick joint controls with my own limbs. It is exhausting work. Sweat stung my eyes. The recycled air tasted stale, tinted with the flavor of copper and old rubber. My breathing echoed in the cramped space of the helmet, loud and rhythmic. I held the welding torch against the steel pipe. The arc flared, casting a harsh green glow across the mud of the seafloor. The vibration of the tool buzzed through the arms of the suit and into my own bones. Then the water changed. It is hard to explain how you can feel the ocean shift when you are locked inside 2 inches of armor. The pressure around the suit grew thicker. The fluid dynamics altered. Usually, the deep ocean has a steady, predictable drift. The water, pushing against my back, became turbulent, churning in erratic circles. I kept my focus on the weld. My shift was almost over. I blamed the weird currents on a thermal vent venting nearby. Down here, your brain tries to find logic in the dark. It is a survival mechanism. If you let yourself imagine what might be swimming just outside the light, you will panic and hyperventilate, burning through your oxygen. I finished the first half of the scene. I leaned back to inspect the join. 3 distinct, brutal strikes hit the back of my helmet. The force rattled my teeth. My skull slammed forward into the glass dome. It was not a rock drifting into me. It was deliberate. The rhythm was precise, spaced out evenly, delivered with a force that sent a shockwave traveling down my spine. I froze. The green glow of the welding torch faded into the black water. There was no one else down here. The nearest support diver was resting in the bell, 2 miles up the line. Nothing organic strikes with that kind of calculated rhythm. My chest tightened. The air in the suit felt too thin to breathe. I stared out into the dark water illuminated by my floodlights, searching the edge of the beam for movement. The mud on the seafloor was undisturbed. I remembered the mandate taped to the locker door. My hand shook inside the control sleeves. I raised my right arm, bringing the heavy titanium fist of the suit up to my own head. I struck the side of the helmet twice. The impacts rang in my ears, vibrating through the metal collar. Then I reached for the chest console. I flipped the toggle switch for the floodlights. The lights died. Absolute, suffocating darkness swallowed me. I sat there on the bottom of the trench, blind. The silence inside the suit was vast, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breath. I waited for the tether line attached to my back to go taut. I waited for the surface crew to pull me up. The ocean around me was no longer still. I could feel the displacement of the water pressing against the suit. Something massive was circling. It pushed tidal waves of force against the titanium legs, swaying my massive rig side to side. The mud beneath my boots shifted as the water churned. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the joysticks in the arms so hard my knuckles throbbed. I trusted the protocol. The company knew something about this trench. They wrote the rule for a reason. Do not look. Do not move. Let the dark hide you. The displaced water brushed against my faceplate. A slow, localized current dragged across the glass, tracing a path from the left side of the dome to the right, as if something were dragging an immense appendage across the barrier between us. The sheer size of whatever was pushing the water made my stomach turn. I kept my mouth shut. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I just needed the winch to engage. A violent jerk pulled at my shoulders. The tether snapped tight. My boots lifted off the mud. The ascent began. I was dragged up through the pitch-black column of water. I did not turn my lights back on. I kept my eyes fixed on the dials inside my suit, watching the depth gauge tick upward. The violent churning of the water slowly faded the higher I got, replaced by the smooth, steady drag of the ocean. The long trip to the surface was an agonizing test of endurance. I recited the steps for equipment maintenance in my head to keep from losing my mind. Clean the seals. Check the filters. Grease the joints. Just focus on the protocol. The massive rig finally broke the surface. The crane swung me over the deck and lowered me onto the metal grating of the barge. The locking mechanism on the tether released. The support crew swarmed the suit. They spun the locking rings on the helmet and lifted the heavy dome off my shoulders. Bright, blinding fluorescent light poured over me. The smell of diesel fuel and salty sea air flooded my senses. I inhaled deeply, the crisp oxygen burning my lungs in the best way possible. The crew chief clapped me on the shoulder, asking if I was all right. I nodded, stepping out of the rigid legs of the suit. My legs were shaking, but the terror was bleeding away. I was standing in the dry, warm decompression chamber a few minutes later, stripping off the thermal underlayers. The nightmare was over. Just a strange encounter in the deep, thwarted by following the rules. I sat on the edge of the bench in my normal clothes, waiting for the pressure to balance out. I ran a hand over a towel, drying the sweat from my neck. My dive helmet sat on the table across from me, waiting to be cleaned. I reached over to grab it, inspecting the back plate where I felt the impacts. There were 3 deep, ragged dents forced into the reinforced titanium shell, clustered near the base of the skull, but the torn metal was blooming outward, punched into the steel from the inside of the helmet. Server rooms are built to be cold, but frost should never form on the plastic casing of a fiber optic cable. I noticed it around 3 in the morning. I am the only technician on duty for the night shift. My job is to sit in the basement of this office complex and make sure the internal network does not crash. It is mostly just monitoring glowing screens and ignoring the drone of the cooling fans. The primary server farm is housed in a cramped, windowless room at the end of a concrete hallway. It is packed with towering metal racks full of blinking hardware. The noise in there is deafening. A constant rushing roar of air conditioning units fighting the heat generated by the machines. I went in to swap out a dead hard drive in rack 4. The moment I pulled the heavy fire doors shut behind me, the temperature hit my skin like a wall of ice. It stung my face. My breath plumed into thick white fog under the harsh fluorescent lights. I rubbed my arms, shivering violently. The thermostat on the wall read -10 degrees. That is impossible. The system has safeties. It should trigger an alarm long before it drops below 60. I walked down the narrow aisle between the rows of machines. The cold was brutal. It gnawed at the tips of my fingers, making them stiff and clumsy. I tried to focus on the task. Rack 4 was located at the far end of the room, tucked into a corner. I stopped walking. Rack 4 looked closer than it did yesterday. The metal tower was sitting flush against the edge of the floor tiles, nearly blocking the aisle. I squeezed my eyes shut and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Fatigue does strange things to your depth perception. I had been staring at monitors for 7 hours straight. Eye strain and a lack of sleep were throwing off my spatial awareness. I told myself it was just a shadow tricking my brain under the awful lighting. I turned my back to the rack to grab a screwdriver from my tool belt. I fumbled with the pouch, my fingers burning from the extreme cold. I turned back around. The metal rack was another foot closer. I stared at it. The massive structure had moved. It was now overlapping the seam of the floor tiles, tilting slightly toward me. There are no wheels on these units. They are bolted directly into the concrete subfloor to prevent damage during an earthquake. A spike of frustration cut through my confusion. This was ridiculous. The cold was making me crazy. The bolts must have snapped from some thermal contraction caused by the broken AC unit. That was the logical answer. The extreme temperature drop had compromised the mounting brackets, causing the tower to shift under its own weight. The air grew even colder. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. The skin on my face felt tight, the moisture freezing on my eyelashes. I needed to get out of this room before I got frostbite. I decided to forget the hard drive swap. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I needed to document the broken thermostat and the shifting rack for the maintenance guys on the day shift. My fingers could barely operate the touchscreen. I opened the camera app and hit record. I panned the lens across the frost, covering the cables. I pointed it at the thermostat, displaying the impossible numbers. Then I moved the phone to frame rack 4, intending to show how it had slid out of place. I kept my eyes on the small screen of my phone, framing the shot. The digital display provided a barrier between me and the freezing room. As I watched the screen, the rack slid forward another 2 feet. It moved smoothly, gliding across the floor without making a single scrape or vibration. It just displaced the space it occupied. I lowered the phone, looking directly at the rack with my own eyes. It stood completely still, my chest seized. The cold in the room felt less like broken machinery and more like a deliberate, hostile force draining the heat from my body. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the towering metal structures. I kept my back straight, moving step by step toward the heavy fire door. I pushed the exit bar and stumbled out into the warm, carpeted hallway. The door slammed shut behind me with a solid latch. The heat of the building washed over me. thawing my frozen joints. I leaned against the cinder block wall, gasping for air. The terror began to recede, replaced by the comforting reality of the normal office building. It was just a malfunction, a freak combination of freezing temperatures and optical illusions. I walked down the hall to the lobby. The front desk guard, Marcus, was supposed to be on duty, but his chair was empty. A half-eaten sandwich sat on his blotter. He was probably doing his rounds on the upper floors. I did not want to stay in the building. I needed to sit in my car and blast the heater until I stopped shaking. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and walked out into the dark parking lot. I climbed into my sedan, started the engine, and cranked the climate control to maximum heat. The warm air blasted my face. I sank back into the upholstery, closing my eyes and letting out a long, ragged sigh. I was safe. I was out of that freezer. I picked up my phone from the passenger seat. I wanted to see the video. I needed to confirm that the rack had actually moved on camera, to prove to myself that my mind was not breaking down. I tapped a thumbnail in my gallery. The video played. It showed the frosted cables. It showed the impossible thermostat. Then the camera panned toward rack 4. The metal tower was there, just as I remembered. But in the dark space right behind the display server, Marcus was standing completely motionless, facing away from the lens. And as the cold air blew from my car vents, I watched his head smoothly rotate 180 degrees over his spine to stare directly into the camera while his lips formed my name. I taste rusted iron, but my mouth is closed and the cabin air is dry. Flying agricultural jobs at night is a specific kind of isolation. You are alone in a machine built for utility, suspended over miles of empty land. The farmers prefer night applications because the wind dies down, allowing the chemicals to settle on the crops without drifting away into neighboring fields. The pay rate is exceptional, but the mental toll is severe. The towns below are asleep. The scattered farmhouses are dark. You exist in a solitary bubble, a single-engine turbine aircraft cutting through the dark sky. My plane was an aging model, a weathered workhorse carrying enough toxic payload in the hopper to coat a small county. I sat locked in the cramped cockpit, staring at the green glow of the instrument panel, letting the GPS guide me down the next long row of corn. The cockpit of this plane is not designed for human comfort. The seat is rigid fiberglass. The multi-point harnesses dig deep into your collarbones. The smell of aviation fuel and bitter pesticide is a permanent fixture in the upholstery. You spend hours suspended over the earth, trusting a glowing screen to tell you where the power lines and trees are hidden. The world outside the acrylic canopy is a dark void, broken only by the silver light of the moon reflecting off the endless geometric patterns of the fields. The taste started around 2 in the morning. It was subtle in the beginning, a slight metallic tang pooling in the back of my throat. I swallowed hard, trying to clear the sensation. I figured I had bitten the inside of my cheek without realizing it during a sharp bank. I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching the dim outline of the distant hills. The altimeter read 20 feet. When you are flying that close to the dirt in the dark, you do not have time to worry about a dry throat. You watch your altitude, and you trust the instruments to keep you out of the ground. The taste refused to fade. It grew richer, far more pronounced. It coated my teeth and coated the roof of my mouth. It felt as though I was holding a fistful of rusted pennies under my tongue. My saliva turned thick, carrying the foul flavor of stagnant well water and raw iron. I convinced myself it was a mechanical defect. The turbine engine was ancient. An old seal was probably degrading, leaking microscopic droplets of synthetic fluid into the cabin ventilation system. Nausea is a known side effect of breathing bad exhaust fumes. Fatigue was another massive factor playing against me. I had been awake for 20 hours, flying back-to-back contracts to make up for lost time earlier in the planting season. When the brain gets exhausted, the senses start to misfire. Wires get crossed in the dark. A strange smell turns into a bizarre taste. I cracked the small side vent to let in some outside air, hoping the rush of oxygen would clear my head and settle my stomach. The air outside offered no relief. The metallic flavor only intensified, growing sharp enough to make my jaw ache. I banked the aircraft, pulling up over a line of utility cables to turn around for the next pass. The moon was a brilliant silver disk hanging in the cloudless sky. It cast a harsh light over the fields, turning the tall stalks of corn into a textured ocean of gray and black. As I leveled out and dropped back down to 20 feet, I saw the shadow. The moonlight projected the silhouette of my aircraft onto the crops below. It kept pace with me, a dark cross gliding over the agricultural grid. It is a very common sight. You get used to flying with your own shadow as your only companion on these long runs. But as I stared at the dark shape pacing me on the ground, the geometry felt wrong. The silhouette of an airplane should be a simple cross, wingspan and fuselage. The shadow below me possessed extra limbs. Long, jagged shapes extended from the trailing edges of the wings. They did not look like mechanical flaps or ailerons. They looked like massive spines, organic and sharp, cutting through the silver light. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my leather glove. The metallic taste in my mouth was unbearable now. I gagged, forcing the rising bile back down my throat. The fumes, I told myself. The fumes are causing a visual hallucination. The lack of oxygen is making my eyes play tricks on the moonlit terrain. I focused my vision on the glowing instruments inside the cockpit. I checked the spray pressure. I checked the fuel gauge. Everything read normal. The engine vibrated with a steady, reliable rhythm. I made a deal with myself. I bargained with the rising panic. I just needed to finish this specific field. 4 more passes. That equals about 10 minutes of flight time. Once the hopper was empty, I would pull up, fly back to the airstrip, and tell the boss the exhaust manifold needed an immediate inspection. I use logic as a shield to keep the terror at bay. I can survive 10 minutes of nausea. I can ignore a weird shadow for 10 minutes. I just needed to focus on the task and follow the glowing line on the screen. I reached the end of the row, pulled back on the yoke, and banked hard to the left. The shadow on the ground did not turn with me. I leveled the wings, flying perpendicular to my previous path. I looked down through the scratched window. The dark shape with the jagged spines was still traveling in a straight line, cutting across the rows of corn, moving independently of my aircraft. My breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, stinging my eyes. I refused to accept the visual information. A shadow cannot detach itself from the object casting it. It defies the basic rules of light. I told myself it was a massive agricultural drone. Another pilot out here flying an automated rig, or a strange cloud formation passing in front of the moon. I threw every rational explanation I could find at the anomaly, trying to build a wall of logic around my fracturing reality. I turned the plane back into the field, aligning with the glowing screen for the next pass. The metallic taste was so potent I was dry heaving. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look down at the ground. Just fly the strip. Keep the wings level. Do not look out the window. Do not acknowledge the impossible thing in the dark. The air inside the cockpit grew freezing cold. The temperature drop was severe, frosting the edges of the instrument panel in a matter of seconds. Something blocked the moonlight. The interior of the cabin plunged into absolute darkness. The silver glow illuminating my lap vanished. I glanced out the side window. The shadow was no longer on the ground. It was gliding alongside my wing, a massive void of pure blackness that absorbed all ambient light. The jagged spines were vast, stretching outward in impossible directions, dwarfing my small aircraft. It matched my speed perfectly, hovering just inches beyond the wingtip. I did not reach for the radio. I did not touch the throttle to accelerate. I knew calling for help would do nothing. The tower was miles away. No one could reach me in time. No one could explain a void flying in formation with a solitary pilot. The fight left me. I took my hands off the yoke. I let my arms rest on my lap. The resignation washed over me, a tidal wave of bleak acceptance. The plane continued to fly straight, held steady by the mechanical trim. The immense, impossible shape outside the window began to drift closer, phasing through the metal wing of my aircraft without making a single mark or vibration. It merged into the cabin. The darkness folded over the dashboard, swallowing the glowing instruments one by one. The navigation lights disappeared into the void. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the rigid seat, feeling the freezing air press against my face as the thick, coppery flavor in my mouth faded. replaced by the dry, suffocating grit of loose grave dirt coating the back of my tongue. A house should never feel like it is hanging upside down while you are lying flat on your stomach. The emergency call came in near midnight. The customer was an estate manager handling a sprawling Victorian home on the edge of town. The property was unoccupied, sitting on a foundation of crumbling river stone that dated back over a century. A main water line had burst somewhere under the living room, flooding the dirt subfloor. The manager unlocked the front door, handed me the keys, and left right away. He refused to stay inside the empty house. My job was straightforward. Go into the basement, crawl under the foundation, find the break, and patch the PVC pipe. I descended the wooden stairs into the dark basement. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mildew, dead insects, and wet earth. The access point to the crawl space was a small square cutout at the base of the foundation wall, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I strapped a headlamp over my hardhead, tied a rope to my tool bag so I could drag it behind me, and squeezed through the opening. The space under the house was suffocating. The clearance between the dirt floor and the wooden joists above was maybe 18 inches. I had to army crawl, pulling myself forward with my elbows, keeping my face inches from the soil. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating spider webs thick with dust and the rusted iron pipes of the original plumbing system. Every movement required raw exertion. The dirt stuck to my sweat-soaked uniform. The metal buckle of my belt scraped against loose stones. The claustrophobia was a constant pressure against my chest, a reminder of the thousands of pounds of wood and stone sitting just inches above my spine. I reached the center of the house after 10 minutes of grueling progress. The dirt here was turned to slick mud. I found the broken pipe, a clean crack along a joint. Easy fix. I laid my tools out on a dry patch of earth. I reached into my bag for the pipe cutter. That is when the vertigo hit. It was not a subtle wave of dizziness. It was a violent, jarring shift in my equilibrium. The world tilted. My brain screamed that gravity had reversed. The sensation was so intense I threw my arms out, digging my fingers deep into the mud to keep myself from falling upward into the floorboards. My stomach dropped. The narrow beam of my headlamp swayed erratically as my vision spun. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe. The house is not moving, I told myself. You are lying flat on solid earth. It is just exhaustion. Dehydration. The tight space messing with your balance. I kept my hands planted in the dirt, waiting for the spinning to stop. A whisper drifted out of the open drain pipe. Arthur Thomas Vance. My eyes snapped open. I froze. The voice was clear, echoing slightly against the plastic walls of the pipe. It was not a generic greeting. It was my full legal name. The tone was conversational, devoid of emotion, like someone reading a ledger. I stared at the dark opening of the pipe. The silence in the crawl space returned, thick and oppressive. I let out a dry, forced laugh. The sound was pathetic in the tight space. Great, I muttered aloud, my voice trembling. Ghost rats. That is exactly what I need tonight. Ghost rats that know my middle name. I used humor as a shield. If I made a joke out of it, I stripped the situation of its power. I talked out loud to normalize the bizarre event, filling the silent void under the house with my own voice. Probably just the wind rushing through a vent, I said, reaching for my tools with shaking hands. A weird acoustic trick. The wind hits the sewer grate on the street, travels through the main line, and sounds like a word. Basic physics. Nothing crazy. I worked as fast as I could. I kept the broken section of pipe, the friction of the blade slicing through the plastic echoing loudly against the floorboards above. I grabbed the purple primer, swabbing the ends of the pipe. The harsh, chemical smell of the solvent filled the confined area, burning my nose. I welcomed the distraction. The fumes gave me a reason to feel lightheaded. Almost done, you creepy old house. I kept talking, forcing the words out into the dark. I will be out of your hair in 5 minutes. You can go back to whispering at the spiders. I glued the new fitting into place, holding it firm for 30 seconds while the cement cured. The repair was messy, but it would hold. I packed my tools back into the canvas bag, desperate to escape the crushing weight of the floor joists and the lingering nausea in my gut. Turning around in a space that narrow is impossible. You have to reverse out exactly the way you came in. I began the long, agonizing slide backward. I pushed with my palms, dragging my body over the uneven dirt, pulling the tool bag along by the ankle rope. The air grew colder the further I moved from the center of the house. My elbows ached. My neck cramped from trying to keep my head up. I stopped halfway to the exit. I needed to check my path. I unclipped the flashlight from my belt and shined the beam forward, past my own boots, illuminating the path I had carved on my way in. I wanted to see how far I was from the foundation wall opening. The bright circle of light hit the ground. The thick layer of gray dust coating the dry earth in front of me was gone. When I crawled in, my knees and elbows had left distinct, chaotic tracks in the dirt. But those marks were erased. Instead, the ground stretching out toward the exit was smoothed over, deeply grooved by a single, continuous track. It looked as if a massive weight had been dragged across the soil, flattening everything in its path. I stared at the groove. It was wider than my shoulders. It led directly toward me, ending just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, plunging into the shadows beneath the floorboards. I did not try to crawl any faster. I did not call out for help. The humor evaporated, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing dread. I lowered the flashlight, letting the beam rest on the dirt right in front of my face, and I stopped breathing altogether as I felt the cold earth vibrate against my chest as something massive dragged itself forward directly beneath my ribs. I never liked the way plastic faces stare out from the dark storefronts when the main lights go down. My job was to walk the interior of the shopping center from midnight until dawn. The place was a sprawling maze of tile, glass, and dead retail space. It took 3 hours just to walk a single circuit of the 2 floors. I was the only person inside a structure built to hold thousands. The silence was absolute. It pressed against my ears, making the rustle of my uniform shirt sound far too loud. The air always smelled like floor wax and old cinnamon pretzels, a lingering ghost of the daytime crowds. I was on the 2nd floor, doing my pass by the Anchor department store. The metal security gate was pulled down, locked tight. The displays behind the gate were shrouded in shadows. I walked at a steady pace, sweeping my flashlight beam back and forth across the corridor. I saw it just as I passed a large ceramic planter. A figure was standing in the corridor, maybe 20 feet behind me, right on the edge of my vision. I stopped walking. I did not turn my head right away. The shape was locked in the far corner of my left eye. It stood rigid, tall, and unnatural. I knew the layout of this corridor. There was supposed to be a trash can and a bench there, nothing else. I whipped my head around, shining the flashlight straight at the spot. Nothing. The beam illuminated the metal trash can and the wooden bench. The space was empty. The tiled floor reflected the harsh glare of my light. I stood there, my chest rising and falling, scanning the dark corners of the alcove. There was no place to hide, no doorways, no shadows deep enough to conceal a person. I did not try to explain it away. I did not tell myself it was a trick of the light or a symptom of working the graveyard shift. A cold spike of raw dread drove itself into my gut. I knew what I saw. It was a mannequin, a pale, featureless thing standing out in the open, far away from any display window. I turned my back to the empty spot and kept walking. My pace was faster now. My boots hit the tiles with a rushed, uneven rhythm. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, gripping the cold metal cylinder of my flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I reached the promenade overlooking the food court. The glass skylights far above let in a pale, weak wash of moonlight. It cast long, distorted shadows across the tables and chairs down below. The mall used large potted ficus trees to decorate the open spaces. They were scattered everywhere, dark blobs of fake leaves resting in wide ceramic pots. As I walked along the glass railing, my peripheral vision caught another shape. Down in the food court, standing in the middle of the tables. The shadow of a potted plant looked wrong. It was too tall, too thin. It lacked the jagged edges of branches. It possessed the distinct sloping shoulders of a human torso cast in rigid plastic. I refused to look down. I kept my eyes locked on the exit sign at the far end of the promenade. But my eyes naturally tracked movement. and they naturally seek out shapes in the dark. As I hurried along the railing, the corner of my eye registered more of them. The shadows of the indoor plants were changing. They were being replaced. Every time a dark patch entered the outer limits of my vision, it shifted into a standing figure. 3 of them gathered near the dead escalators. 2 more, standing by the darkened carousel. They were scattered across the lower level, visible only when I did not focus on them. Panic took hold. It was a cold, acidic wash flooding my veins. I broke into a jog. I needed to get outside. I needed to leave the building. The vast, empty space of the mall felt like a shrinking box. The air grew stagnant. The smell of floor wax made me want to throw up. I jogged past a row of clothing boutiques, my breathing loud and ragged in the quiet air. More shapes crowded the edges of my sight. They were lining the walls of the second floor now, standing just outside the closed storefronts. Whenever I stared straight ahead, the corridor looked empty. But the moment my focus wavered, the blurry edges of my vision filled with rigid, featureless statues. They were creeping closer. The space between us was shrinking. I did not stop to check my radio. I did not bother trying to call the overnight manager. I just ran. I sprinted toward the main entrance at the end of the promenade. The large glass doors were locked from the inside with thick deadbolts. The keys were on a ring attached to my belt, but my hands were shaking too violently to find the right one. The fuzzy, unmoving figures in the corners of my eyes were closing in. They surrounded me, a silent crowd of plastic pressing into my personal space, disappearing every time I darted my eyes toward them. I raised my solid steel flashlight. I swung it as hard as I could against the thick glass of the exit door. The impact jarred my wrist. The glass fractured into a spiderweb of white lines. I swung again. The pane shattered, raining sharp fragments onto the tile. I pushed through the broken frame, ignoring the jagged edges scraping against my uniform jacket. I stumbled out into the cool night air. I ran across the concrete sidewalk and out into the vast, empty parking lot. I did not stop until I was standing directly under the orange glow of a tall street lamp, 50 yards away from the building. I spun around, facing the mall. The dark glass of the entrance reflected the street lamps. Nothing came out. Nothing stood in the shattered doorway. The night was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of highway traffic. I bent over, resting my hands on my knees, sucking in massive gulps of the cold, clean air. The terror began to recede, washing away into exhaustion. I had made it out. I was under the bright lights. I was safe. I told myself to just breathe, to calm down, to let the adrenaline fade. I stood up straight. I reached down to my hip, unclipping the radio from my duty belt to call the local police dispatcher. I needed to report the broken door. I needed to tell them I was leaving the property. I held the radio up to my face, pressing the transmit button with my thumb. I looked down at the device, intending to check the channel dial. My eyes focused on the hand holding the black plastic radio, and I stopped breathing as I stared at the smooth, seamless expanse of pale fiberglass where my knuckles and fingernails should have been. Riding a metal box on a steel cable hundreds of feet above the pavement forces you to trust engineering far more than you should. I worked the late cleaning shift for a high-rise corporate office. By 2 a.m, the building is dead. The office workers are gone. The executives are asleep in their suburban homes. It is just me, a mop bucket, and 50 floors of carpet waiting to be vacuumed. The solitude is usually peaceful. You get used to the quiet. I finished scrubbing the tile in the 34th floor break room. My shift was almost over. I wheeled my yellow bucket down the dark hallway, heading for the service elevator. The passenger cars in the main lobby are lined with nice wood and soft lights. The service car is a grim utilitarian cube. The walls are covered in scratched, tarnished mirrors. The floor is scuffed metal. The lighting is a harsh, flickering fluorescent tube bolted behind a wire mesh grate on the ceiling. I pushed the heavy cart into the car and pressed the button for the ground floor. The door slid shut with a scraping noise. The descent began. I leaned against the cold mirrored wall, staring at my own tired reflection. My uniform shirt was stained with harsh chemicals. My eyes were bloodshot. I just wanted to go home, take a hot shower, and sleep for 10 hours. The elevator stopped. There was no mechanical grinding, no jolt. The downward motion simply ceased. The digital floor indicator above the door went dark. The hum of the electric motor faded into silence. I sighed, rubbing my face. Old buildings have old wiring. Power fluctuations happen. I stepped away from the wall and reached for the control panel. I pressed the ground floor button again. Nothing happened. I pressed the door open button. Dead. I reached for the red emergency phone housed in a small metal box below the buttons. I pulled the receiver to my ear. There was no dial tone, just empty air. I placed the phone back in its cradle. I was stuck. I would have to wait for the system to reset, or for the morning crew to realize the car was jammed between floors. Then, the air changed. The ambient temperature did not drop, but the atmosphere inside the small car grew incredibly dense. It felt as though the space was filling with invisible water. The pressure pushed against my eardrums, creating a dull, throbbing ache. I took a breath, and my lungs struggled to expand. The oxygen felt thick, resisting the pull of my diaphragm. I blamed my own body. I had been working with industrial bleach and ammonia for 6 hours. The fumes in the unventilated bathrooms always messed with my chest. I told myself it was just fatigue. My muscles were tired. My lungs were irritated, and the cramped space of the stalled elevator was triggering a mild bout of claustrophobia. I needed to remain calm. I needed to lower my heart rate so I would not consume the limited air. I looked down at the scuffed metal floor. I focused on the wet strings of the mop resting in the yellow bucket. I used it as a visual anchor to keep my mind grounded. I saw movement in the scratched mirrors lining the walls. The reflection showed the ceiling grate directly above my head. The harsh fluorescent light was still buzzing behind the wire mesh, but a dark shape was pooling over the grate. It looked like a thick black fluid gathering on the other side of the metal crossbars. My neck muscles tightened. The urge to look up was overwhelming. I refused. I kept my chin tucked down, staring hard at the yellow plastic of the mop bucket. The pressure in the car increased. The air was so dense now that drawing a breath required real effort. My chest ached with every inhale. The silence was agonizing, broken only by the ragged sound of my own struggling lungs. I could see the dark shape expanding in the peripheral reflection of the mirrors. It was not dripping. It was oozing through the gaps in the wire mesh, a suspended mass of shadows defying gravity, reaching down toward the top of my head. I closed my eyes. I gripped the handle of the mop to keep my hands from shaking. I bargained with the trapped space. I told myself it was just dirty grease leaking from the elevator cables. A hydraulic fluid line had ruptured. That was all. I just had to wait for the emergency override to kick in. Do not look up. Do not acknowledge the shape. Just stare at the floor and wait. The dense air pressed against my skin. It felt like a physical weight resting on my shoulders. I was suffocating in slow motion, trapped in a mirrored box suspended in a concrete shaft. Then, the doors groaned. The metal scraped as the safety latches disengaged. The two panels slowly pried themselves open, revealing the outside hallway. A rush of cool, conditioned air hit my face. The pressure vanished. My lungs expanded freely, pulling in the clean, thin oxygen. I let go of the mop handle. I stumbled forward, desperate to get out of the cramped car. I left the cart and the bucket behind. I stepped past the threshold and out onto the carpeted floor of the lobby. I slumped against the wall next to the elevator frame, resting my hands on my knees. I was out. I was breathing. The terror of the tight space washed away, leaving me weak and hollow. I laughed, a dry, coughing sound. Just a mechanical failure and a panic attack. Nothing more. I stood up straight, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead. I turned around to see which floor I had been stuck on. I needed to know how many flights of stairs I had to walk down to reach the street level. I looked up at the digital indicator screen mounted into the marble wall above the elevator doors. The red LED numbers did not display a floor in the 30s. It did not display a G for ground. The glowing red lines formed the number 40, and as I stared at the impossible depth, the bright lights illuminating the hallway began snapping off one by one just as the metal doors slowly slid shut. Rotting sugar is not a smell you should find 80 feet underground. I work as a track inspector for the City Transit Authority. My shift begins at midnight, long after the final passenger trains finish their routes. The city shuts off the power to the third rail in designated sectors so teams can walk the tunnels. We look for cracked ties, rusted bolts, and water damage. It is a lonely job. You spend hours walking through endless concrete tubes, illuminated only by the beam of your flashlight and the sparse, caged maintenance bulbs spaced 100 yards apart. The air down there is always the same. It smells of brake dust, old grease, and damp concrete. I was walking Section 4. It is a long, curving stretch of tunnel that runs beneath the financial district. The walls are lined with thick bundles of communication cables and centuries-old soot. The isolation is vast. You can look down the tracks and see nothing but miles of converging steel lines disappearing into the dark. I was an hour into my route when the scent hit me. It drifted down the tunnel on a sluggish current of air. A faint, cloying sweetness. It smelled like burnt cotton candy mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of electrical ozone. I stopped walking. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ceiling vault. I looked for a ventilation grate. Sometimes the exhaust from street-level bakeries or late-night food carts gets pulled down into the subway drafts. But the nearest street vent was over a mile behind me. I started doing the math in my head. I have an engineering background. When things do not make sense, I run the statistics to keep my heart rate down. The odds of a localized chemical fire smelling like candy were less than a fraction of a percent. The odds of discarded trash igniting near an old signal box and producing this specific odor were slightly higher, maybe 1 in 1,000. I lived in a city of millions. Millions of variables create strange anomalies. A stray spark from a maintenance train hitting a discarded candy wrapper. A weird chemical mixture leaking from a street drain. The numbers told me it was a mundane accident. Logic is a reliable anchor when you are surrounded by darkness. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and kept walking. 10 minutes passed. The smell did not fade. It grew stronger. It stopped being a faint trace on the air and became a thick, suffocating cloud. The sweetness was overpowering, a rancid syrup coating the back of my throat with every breath. The ozone smell grew sharp enough to make my eyes water. It tasted like putting a battery on your tongue while chewing spoiled fruit. I wiped my nose with the back of my sleeve. The tunnel remained empty. My boots crunched against the gravel ballast. The only sound was the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the curved walls. I reached a blind corner where the tunnel curved sharply to the left. The maintenance lights in this section were dead. A wall of absolute shadow blocked the path ahead. The rotting sugar scent was pouring out of that darkness. I carry a telescopic inspection mirror on my tool belt. It is a simple tool. Just a round piece of convex glass attached to a long carbon fiber rod. We use it to look under the steel rails without having to crawl on the filthy ground. I unclipped the rod. I extended it to its full length. I did not want to walk around the corner blindly. The statistical probability of a toxic gas leak was rising, and walking into a concentrated pocket of bad air could drop a person in seconds. I angled the mirror, sliding it out past the edge of the concrete wall to catch a glimpse of the tracks ahead. I pointed my flashlight at the glass. The beam reflected off the mirror, illuminating the hidden section of the tunnel. The tracks were empty. The gravel was undisturbed. There was no fire. There was no trash burning. I pulled the mirror back, exhaling a tight breath. Just a weird draft carrying a foul odor from another part of the system. I told myself to report it to dispatch when I reached the next call box. I lowered the pole, preparing to step around the bend. My legs refused to move. It was a strange, sudden paralysis. The muscles in my calves and thighs locked tight. My boots felt welded to the gravel. It was not a conscious decision. My brain sent the signal to step forward, but my body denied the order. The air around me went dead. The ambient hum of the distant city above vanished. The smell of burnt sugar and ozone was no longer drifting down the tunnel. It was right next to me. The source was so close the scent felt warm against the side of my face. I stood frozen in the dark. I could not turn my head. The fear was a cold vice gripping my ribs, squeezing the air from my lungs. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the grimy concrete wall. A wet, ragged sound broke the silence. It was the sound of a mouth opening, the parting of saliva-coated lips right next to my left ear. I still could not move my legs. I could not run. But my right hand, still gripping the extended pole, trembled. I slowly rotated my wrist. I angled the mirror upward, adjusting the small glass disc so it reflected the space hovering just over my own left shoulder. I watched the glass. The reflection showed the dark tunnel behind me. Then it showed the collar of my own high-visibility vest. Then it showed the face. It was pale, possessing the sickly translucence of things that live deep underground. The jaw was impossibly long, unhinged and hanging open. Thin, wet strands of hair clung to skin that stretched too tight over jagged cheekbones. It was hovering mere inches from my ear, suspended in the dark without a body visible in the frame. A puff of breath hit my neck. It carried the rancid, concentrated stench of burning candy. I stared into the mirror, watching the hollow, sightless indentations where its eyes should have been as the elongated jaw slowly opened wider, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth just before the wet, definitive fracture of bone. A digital audio file does not breathe when you hit pause. I transcribe police interviews for a private firm. We get the overflow work from the city precincts. Hours of tedious, low-quality recordings. Domestic disputes. Minor theft. Vandalism. The job requires sitting in a soundproof booth for 8 hours a day. The walls are covered in dark gray acoustic foam wedges. The door has a rubber seal that locks out the rest of the office. When you sit in that chair and put on the studio headphones, the world ceases to exist. It is just you, a glowing monitor, a keyboard, and the voices of strangers trapped inside your computer. The isolation is intentional. You need absolute focus to decipher mumbled words over the static of a cheap recorder. The silence in the room is so profound you can hear the fluid moving in your own neck when you swallow. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The overhead light was dim. The air conditioning pumped a steady stream of dry, cold air through a tiny vent in the ceiling. I was working on a file labeled Case 42, a routine interview regarding a breaking and entering at a warehouse. The detective had a deep, monotone drawl. The suspect was a young guy, nervous, speaking in clipped sentences. I typed at a steady pace. My fingers moved over the keys with practiced rhythm. I kept my foot resting on the USB pedal under the desk, tapping it to pause and rewind the audio whenever a word was muffled. The recording reached the 40-minute mark. The detective asked a question about a stolen generator. The suspect started to answer. I didn't take it. You can check the audio stuttered. A sharp burst of static crackled through the headphones, loud enough to make me wince. The waveform on my monitor spiked into a solid block of red, indicating a massive audio glitch. Then the static cut out, replaced by a new voice. It did not belong to the detective or the suspect. It was a soft, grating whisper right up against the microphone. Look behind you. I took my foot off the pedal. The audio stopped. I sat still in my ergonomic chair. I stared at the blinking cursor on my word processor. I did not turn around. The booth was roughly the size of a walk-in closet. There was a desk, a chair, and a locked door. No one could fit behind me. I applied basic logic to the situation. Digital files get corrupted. When data transfers over secure servers, packets drop. Sometimes audio bleeds over from other case files during the encryption process. The software tries to patch the missing data and creates bizarre audio artifacts. It was just a string of ruined code manifesting as a phrase. I pressed my foot down on the pedal to resume playback. The timeline moved forward. The waveform on the screen remained a chaotic mess of glitches. Look behind you. The phrase repeated. The exact same inflection. The exact same whisper. Look behind you. I kept my hands on the keyboard. I decided to ignore it. I had a quota to meet. If I stopped every time a file acted up, I would never get paid. I typed out the word unintelligible in brackets on the transcript. The audio looped again. Look behind you. I started typing the next line of the police report from memory, just hitting the keys to give myself a task. I needed the mechanical routine. The tactile feedback of the plastic keys pressing down under my fingertips was a solid, real thing in a room made of foam and silence. The loop sped up. Look behind you. Look behind you. I typed faster. I transcribed nonsense sentences, transcribing random thoughts just to keep my fingers flying. I used the work as a psychological shield. If I was typing, I was working. If I was working, the room was normal. The whisper in the headphones altered its cadence. It matched the exact rhythm of my keystrokes. Every time a finger struck a letter, the voice hit a syllable. Look, space, B, space, U. My chest tightened. The dry air from the vent stung my eyes. The synchronization was impossible. A corrupted file plays at a fixed bitrate. It cannot react to real-time physical inputs. It cannot see my hands. One typed a frantic, uneven sequence of letters. The voice stuttered, matching my erratic speed perfectly. I slammed my palms down on the desk, intending to rip the headphones off my ears. I wanted to break the connection. I wanted to stand up and walk out of the soundproof box. I froze. The logic evaporated. The rational explanations burned away, leaving a cold primal dread pooling in my stomach. If I took the headphones off, I would have to listen to the silence of the room. If I turned around, I would have to look at the space between the back of my chair and the foam wall. I kept the headphones over my ears. I kept my eyes locked on the bright white document on the screen. I slowly lifted my hands away from the keyboard. I let them hover in the air, trembling. I stopped typing altogether. The audio on the timeline continued to scroll forward, but the voice vanished. The static vanished. The recording dropped into absolute pristine silence. The waveform on the monitor flattened into a straight, dead line. I sat there in the quiet booth. I did not move a muscle. I stared at the monitor, trapped in my own chair by the sheer terror of acknowledging whatever had hijacked the tape. The flat line on the screen spiked once. A soft, prolonged sigh played through the left speaker of my headphones. The audio file ended. I sat motionless, staring at the frozen screen, and squeezed my eyes shut as the distinct sensation of a warm, damp puff of breath parted the hair on the back of my neck. The steering column of a freightliner does not have a pulse. Driving a rig across the high desert at 3 a.m. is an exercise in sensory deprivation. You have a narrow tunnel of headlights cutting through the absolute dark. The highway stretches out forever in a straight line. There are no towns, no rest stops, and no other cars. The only things keeping you anchored to reality are the green glow of the dashboard gauges and the steady, reliable rumble of a massive diesel engine beneath your boots. I was on day 4 of a cross-country route. My eyes burned from staring at the white lines on the asphalt. The cabin of my truck was a small, self-contained world. It smelled like stale coffee, diesel fuel, and old vinyl. I had a thermos sitting in the cup holder and a half-empty bag of sunflower seeds on the passenger seat. I kept the radio on low, tuned to an AM station that was mostly static, just to have a voice in the room with me. The vibration started near mile marker 200. It was a subtle tremor at first, a rhythmic flutter traveling up the metal steering shaft and into my palms. I adjusted my grip, thinking the tires had caught a rough patch of pavement. The asphalt out here gets chewed up by the weather and the weight of the commercial trucks. I figured it was just uneven ground. A few miles later, the tremor returned. It was stronger this time. It did not feel like a mechanical issue. When a tire goes out of balance or a suspension rod gets loose, the vibration is chaotic. It shakes the whole cab. This tremor was isolated. It pulsed with a distinct repeating pattern. 3 short beats followed by a long pause. I leaned forward in my seat, frowning at the dashboard. I checked the air pressure gauges. I checked the engine temperature. Everything was normal. The truck was running fine. I blamed the isolation. Fatigue does weird things to a person. When you sit in a vibrating box for 12 hours a day, your nerves get tired. You start to feel phantom motions, even after you park. I decided my hands were just cramping. I stretched my fingers, gripping the wheel looser. The AM radio crackled. The faint voice of the talk show host faded out, buried under a wash of white noise. The static was loud, aggressive. It swelled in the small cabin, filling the space with a harsh hiss. As the static peaked, the steering wheel shuddered in my hands. The rhythm of the vibration matched the rhythm of the radio interference perfectly. The static surged. The wheel shook. The static dipped. The wheel went still. I reached out and turned the radio dial, trying to find a clear station. The static persisted across every frequency. The wheel kept vibrating in time with the noise. I told myself it was an electrical short. A loose wire in the dashboard was grounding out against the steering column, sending a small current into the metal while simultaneously messing with the radio antenna. It was a logical conclusion. Old trucks have bad wiring. It made sense. I turned the radio off. The static stopped. The steering wheel went dead still. I exhaled a long breath, proud of my quick diagnosis. It was just a wiring issue. I would have the mechanics look at it when I reached the depot in the morning. I settled back into my seat, taking a sip from my thermos. The silence in the cab was thick, but it was better than the awful noise. I cleared my throat. The steering wheel jerked violently. The tremor was so strong it nearly tore the wheel from my grip. I slammed my foot on the brake, wrestling the massive truck onto the dirt shoulder of the highway. The trailer swayed, the tires kicking up a massive cloud of dust. I brought the rig to a harsh stop, throwing the transmission into neutral and pulling the parking brake. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat there in the dark, my hands hovering inches away from the black plastic of the steering wheel. The engine idled quietly. The cab was still. I did not understand what had just happened. The radio was off. There was no electrical current. I sat in the silence for a full minute. I watched the dust settle in the glow of my headlights. The desert outside was an ocean of black scrub brush and sand. I was miles away from another human being. I whispered a single word. "Oh." The steering column vibrated. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the dashboard panels. The tremor traveled up the metal shaft, shaking the plastic wheel with a force that defied mechanics. The vibration reacted to sound. Panic is a cold thing. It started in my stomach and crawled up into my throat. The logic I had built crumbled away. Wires do not listen. Metal does not react to a human voice. I needed to get out of the driver's seat. I needed to put distance between myself and the controls of the truck. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt. The fabric slid against my jacket, making a soft scraping noise. The steering wheel vibrated in response, a low, angry hum. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to take slow, shallow breaths through my nose. I moved with agonizing care. I slipped out of the rigid driver's seat and climbed into the sleeper cab in the back of the truck. The sleeper is a cramped space behind the seats. It holds a narrow mattress, some storage nets, and a privacy curtain. I pulled the heavy curtain shut, sealing myself in the dark. I curled into a ball on the mattress. I pulled a thick wool blanket over my head. I did not move. I did not speak. I held my breath whenever I felt the urge to cough. The silence in the cab was absolute. The only sound was the low, steady idle of the diesel engine outside. Hours crawled by. I lay there in the stifling dark, trapped in my own truck, too terrified to make a single noise. Every time my jacket rustled, I felt the floorboards under the mattress hum with that impossible vibration. Something was inside the machinery. Something was waiting for me to speak. I watched the digital clock on my phone. 3 in the morning turned into 4. 4 turned into 5. The sky outside the curtain began to turn gray. The sun was coming up. Daylight brings a specific kind of courage. The shadows retreat, and the world feels real again. I pushed the blanket off my face. I listened. The truck was quiet. I slowly pushed the curtain aside. The cab was empty. The steering wheel looked normal. I climbed back into the driver's seat, moving quietly. I released the parking brake, put the truck in gear, and pulled back onto the highway. I did not turn the radio on. I did not say a word. I just drove. An hour later, I saw the neon sign of a diner standing alone on the edge of the desert. The parking lot was filled with other commercial trucks. The sight of other people, of normal life, brought a wave of intense relief. I parked the rig and walked inside. The diner was bright, filled with the smell of bacon and old coffee. Drivers sat at booths reading newspapers. The jukebox was playing a soft country song. I slid into a booth near the window. I let out a long, ragged sigh, letting the tension bleed out of my muscles. I was safe. I was out of the dark. I survived a bizarre night of sensory hallucination brought on by extreme exhaustion. A waitress walked over to my table. Her name tag read Judy. She carried a glass pot of dark coffee. "Rough night out there?" she asked, setting a thick ceramic mug down in front of me. I smiled, rubbing my tired eyes. "You have no idea. Just glad to be sitting somewhere that doesn't shake." Judy did not smile back. She lifted the glass pot to pour the coffee. Her hand trembled. It was a violent, rhythmic shaking that rattled the glass pot against the rim of my ceramic mug. She leaned down close to my face, her eyes wide and hollow. "It's still vibrating, honey," she whispered. I stared in horror as the dark liquid inside the mug began to ripple in perfect time with her voice, right before the glass pot shattered and the scalding coffee splashed across my bare knuckles. Opening the back panel of a vintage arcade cabinet usually releases the smell of burnt dust and old carpet, not a blast of furnace heat. I fix vending machines and arcade games for a route operator. My territory covers a string of dying strip malls and dusty bowling alleys on the edge of the city. The job is a solitary one. I work late at night when the locations are closed, so I do not have to deal with angry customers demanding their lost quarters back. You get a set of keys, a toolbox, and a list of addresses. It was past midnight when I unlocked the side door of a closed arcade. The place was a tomb. Rows of unplugged racing games and broken pinball machines stood in the dark like dead monuments. The patterned carpet absorbed the sound of my boots. The air was stale, smelling of cheap pizza grease and ozone. My work order was for a photo booth tucked in the far back corner. The manager said the coin return was jammed and the machine was eating money. I walked past the dark screens and found the booth. It was an old model, a heavy wooden box covered in faded curtains. A small stool sat inside. The coin slot on the outside was taped over with a piece of masking tape that read, "Out of order." I set my heavy metal toolbox down on the carpet. I grabbed a socket wrench and stepped around to the back of the machine to remove the service panel. The metal panel was warm to the touch. I frowned. Arcade machines generate heat, but they are designed to vent it. A machine sitting idle in a dark, air-conditioned room should be cool. I fitted the wrench over the bolts and spun them loose. I pulled the heavy metal sheet away from the cabinet. A wave of blistering heat hit my face. It was shocking, a dry, oppressive wall of hot air that felt like opening an oven door. I stumbled back a step, raising an arm to shield my eyes. The heat washed over my uniform shirt, pulling the moisture from my skin. I squinted into the exposed interior of the machine. The wiring was a mess of old cables and circuit boards. There was no fire. There was no smoke. But the ambient temperature radiating from the components was staggering. I diagnosed the issue using basic electronics knowledge. The halogen flashbulbs used in these old booths require a massive power draw. The transformer regulating that voltage was probably failing, creating a runaway thermal loop. It was a common, dangerous malfunction. If left alone, it could easily start a fire inside the wooden cabinet. I reached into my toolbox and pulled out my phone. My boss requires photo documentation of burnt or damaged components before he approves ordering replacement parts. I stepped closer to the open back of the booth. The heat was unbearable. It stung my eyes and made it difficult to draw a full breath. Sweat beaded on my forehead, rolling down my neck and soaking the collar of my shirt. I leaned into the sweltering space, aiming my phone camera at the massive power supply block near the floor of the cabinet. I pressed the screen to take a picture. A bright white light erupted from inside the passenger area of the photo booth. The flash was blinding. It leaked through the cracks in the wooden boards, casting harsh shadows against the arcade wall. I flinched, dropping my arm. The flash mechanism was supposed to be triggered by the camera timer, not by a service technician standing behind the unit. Before my vision could clear, a second flash fired, then a third. The rhythm was exact. The distinct pacing of a 4-picture strip being taken. I backed away from the machine, wiping the stinging sweat from my eyes. The heat was making me dizzy. The enclosed space of the arcade felt like it was shrinking. The flashes meant the internal computer was still active, despite the massive thermal failure. I did not want to stand in front of the open panel anymore. The heat was making my skin feel tight and raw. I needed cool air. I left my toolbox on the floor and walked away from the photo booth. I paced down the aisle of dark arcade games, letting the cold air conditioning of the building wash over me. It felt amazing. The oppressive, suffocating heat evaporated. My breathing returned to normal. I leaned against a dusty skee-ball lane, rubbing my face with both hands. I felt ridiculous. It was just a broken transformer and a short-circuiting flashbulb. A mundane, mechanical accident. Nothing to panic about. I just needed to unplug the main power cord from the wall, document the damage, and leave. I walked back down the aisle toward the photo booth. The air around the machine had cooled down significantly. The terrifying heat wave was gone. The machine sat silent in the dark corner. As I approached the front of the booth, I heard a mechanical whirring sound. The small metal slot below the coin return engaged. A pair of rollers spun, and a glossy strip of photo paper pushed its way out into the collection tray. I stopped walking. The arcade was empty. The machine had flashed while I was standing behind it. There was no one sitting on the small stool inside the curtained area. I told myself it was a test strip. Sometimes, when a machine resets, it prints the last image stored in its memory buffer. A photo of a teenager from 3 days ago. Just a ghost in the machine's cache. I reached down and pinched the edge of the photo strip. The paper was still warm from the developing chemicals. I pulled it out of the tray and held it up to catch the weak light spilling from a distant exit sign. There were 4 square frames printed in a vertical line. I looked at the top frame. It was a picture of me. I was standing in the exact spot I was in right now, holding a photo strip in my hand, standing next to the skee-ball lane. But I was not wearing my work uniform. I was wearing a torn, filthy jacket I had never seen before. I looked at the second frame. The angle was closer. My face filled the square. My eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. I looked at the third frame. My mouth was open in a silent scream, but the lips were bound tightly together by thick, black, jagged thread, puncturing the skin in a messy, chaotic pattern. I stared at the images, my brain refusing to process the impossible geometry. The camera was inside the booth. I was standing outside. The clothes were wrong. The mutilation was wrong. I did not try to run. I did not try to drop the paper. I stood frozen in the dark arcade, staring at the fourth frame showing my own mutilated face staring back at me, as the smooth, glossy surface of the photo paper suddenly blistered and seared deep into the flesh of my thumb. Fresh water from an aluminum canteen should not taste like decaying autumn leaves. I wiped the condensation from my mouth with the back of my glove. The water was cold, drawn from the tap at the ranger station that morning, but it left a bitter, rotting film across my tongue. I spit into the dirt, trying to clear the flavor. It lingered, tasting of wet soil and old bark. I stood in the center of Sector 4, a vast grid of old-growth timber in the northern section of the national park. My job was search and rescue. A tourist had wandered off the marked trails 3 days ago. The local sheriff called in the park service, and they divided the valley into search grids. I drew the furthest sector. It was miles away from the main access roads. The trees out here were massive, their roots forming thick, moss-covered walls. The canopy overhead was so dense it choked out the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a permanent state of dim green twilight. Walking a search grid alone is a methodical, draining process. You walk a straight line for 100 yards, turn, take 10 paces right, and walk back. You look for broken branches. You look for candy wrappers. You look for disturbed earth. You do not expect to find much. The wilderness swallows people with terrifying efficiency. I checked my GPS tracker. I was halfway through my designated area. The radio on my shoulder harness was dead quiet. The rock walls of the valley blocked the signal, cutting me off from the base camp. I was alone in a staggering expanse of silent wilderness. I took another drink from my canteen. The taste of rot was stronger this time. It coated the roof of my mouth. It tasted the way a swamp smells when the summer sun bakes the stagnant water. I poured a little of the water into my hand. It was perfectly clear. No sediment. No algae. I dumped the rest of the canteen onto the ground, unwilling to drink another drop. I blamed the metal lining of the flask. Old gear degrades. The aluminum probably leached into the water, mixing with trace minerals to create the awful flavor. I resumed my sweep, pushing through a thick patch of ferns. The ground here was soft, saturated from a rainstorm the night before. My boots sank into the dark mud with a soft squelch. I stopped. 10 yards ahead, half buried under a pile of wet pine needles, was a boot. I approached it slowly. It was a left boot, hiking style, made of brown leather with thick rubber treads. It was wedged deep into the mud, as if someone had stepped into a sinkhole and pulled their foot out, leaving the footwear behind. I knelt beside it. I pulled my digital camera from my vest pocket and snapped a picture of the boot in the mud. Then I pulled it loose. The leather was ruined, soaked through and heavy with water. I checked the inside tag. The size was rubbed off, but it looked fairly new before it met the mud. This did not make sense. The missing tourist was wearing running shoes when he left the trailhead. That was the description we received in the morning briefing. White sneakers, blue jeans, a red jacket. This was a serious hiking boot. It did not belong in this sector. A profound, unearned sadness settled over my chest. It was a bleak melancholy, a crushing weight of despair that had nothing to do with the search. It felt as though I was mourning a loss I could not remember. The forest around me seemed to absorb the light, turning the green shadows into something hostile. I stood up, holding the muddy boot by the laces. The silence of the old growth trees pressed against my ears. I needed to break the quiet. "Well," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast space. "Looks like we have a nudist hiker on the loose." I forced a dry laugh. It was a coping mechanism. I joke when I get uncomfortable. If I talk out loud, I remind myself I am human and I am alive, and the forest is just a bunch of wood and dirt. "Hey, trees," I called out, turning in a slow circle. "If you see a guy walking around with one shoe, tell him he owes me $20 for carrying this thing." I tied the laces of the found boot to a carabiner on my backpack. It dangled against my hip as I walked. I needed to finish the sweep, log the coordinates, and hike back before nightfall. The hours dragged. The taste of rotting leaves in my mouth grew so sharp I felt nauseous. I chewed on a piece of mint gum from my survival kit, but the flavor of peppermint twisted into the taste of rusted metal and wet ash. My throat was dry. My legs ached from navigating the uneven terrain. The sadness continued to dig into my thoughts, making every step feel like a march toward a funeral. By late afternoon, the light failed. The green twilight turned to charcoal. I reached the edge of my grid and clicked my flashlight on. The beam cut a narrow path through the encroaching dark. I turned my back to the deep woods and began the long hike toward the ranger station. I talked to myself the whole way back. I recited movie plots. I complained about the cheap uniforms the department issued. I kept a steady stream of noise flowing to keep the isolation at bay. The found boot slapped rhythmically against my pack, a persistent reminder of the unknown. I finally saw the warm yellow light of the station shining through the trees. The building was a small, single-room log cabin used as an outpost for the northern sector. It had a wood stove, a cot, and a radio repeater. I jogged the last 50 yards, taking the wooden steps 2 at a time. I pushed the door open and locked the deadbolt behind me. The cabin was warm. The previous shift had left a fire smoldering in the stove. I leaned against the sturdy wooden door, letting out a long, ragged exhale. I was safe. The oppressive vastness of the forest was locked outside. The irrational dread began to melt away under the glow of the overhead bulb. I walked over to the small table and unclipped my radio harness. I unhooked the muddy boot from my pack and set it on the floorboards. I sat down in the old armchair by the stove to take off my own gear. My feet were killing me. I reached down and unlaced my right boot, pulling it off and tossing it aside. The relief of freeing my foot was immense. I reached for my left boot. I stopped. I looked down at the floor. The muddy boot I found in the woods was resting next to my own discarded right boot. It was the exact same brand. The exact same scuff marks on the reinforced toe. The exact same frayed pattern on the nylon laces. It was my boot. I stared at it. My brain rejected the visual data. I looked at my left foot, still clad in a matching brown leather hiking boot. I looked back at the muddy one on the floor. The dimensions were identical. The wear pattern on the sole matched my gait. I carried my own footwear for 6 miles through the woods, while still wearing it. The bitter taste of rotting leaves flooded my mouth, choking me. I raised my hands to my face, intending to rub my tired eyes, hoping it was just a hallucination born of fatigue. My rough, calloused fingers dragged across my jawline, and I stopped breathing as my thumb snagged on the thick, ragged edge of a cold rubber mask that was slowly peeling away from the bone of my own skull. My inner ear screamed that the floor of my tent was tipped at a 90-degree angle over an open gorge. I lay flat on my back, my arms pinned to my sides by the tight fabric of a mummy sleeping bag. I am a snowpack researcher. I work alone on a remote, high-altitude plateau, measuring the density of the winter accumulation for the state water department. The work requires spending weeks isolated in the alpine zone, miles above the tree line. The environment up here is hostile. The air is thin. The cold is brutal enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. My shelter was a four-season bivy tent, pitched on a flat expanse of compacted snow. The tent is designed for utility, not comfort. It is essentially a low-profile nylon dome, just long enough to lie down in and barely tall enough to sit up. Once you crawl inside and zip the rainfly, you are confined in a space no bigger than a coffin. The wind outside howled, a constant, abrasive force scouring the nylon walls. The temperature was 20 below zero. I was wearing thermal base layers in a thick fleece, encased in a down-filled sleeping bag rated for extreme weather. The only source of light was the pale silver glow of the moon filtering through the thin fabric of the tent roof. I tried to sleep, but the vertigo hit me just past midnight. It was a horrific, plunging sensation. My brain insisted the flat patch of snow beneath me had dropped away. I felt like I was sliding backward toward a bottomless drop. My stomach clenched. I threw my hands out against the sides of the tent, trying to brace myself against a fall that was not happening. I stared up at the curved nylon ceiling. The tent was not moving. The fabric was taut. I was resting on solid ground. I closed my eyes and recited medical protocols. Altitude sickness plays vicious tricks on your equilibrium. Hypoxia starves the brain of oxygen, causing nausea and disorientation. I took slow, deep breaths, forcing the thin, freezing air into my lungs. Hydration, I whispered to myself. Caloric intake, acclimatization. You are at 10,000 feet. The pressure is dropping. Your inner ear is confused. The ground is flat. I used the rules of survival to ground my panic. I broke the situation down into biological facts. It is a necessary tactic when you are trapped in a tiny space. If you let the claustrophobia merge with the physical symptoms of altitude sickness, you will tear your way out of the tent and freeze to death in the snow. I gripped the edge of my sleeping pad, waiting for the spinning to stop. The moonlight illuminating the tent ceiling vanished. A shadow fell over the nylon dome. It was not a cloud passing over the moon. The darkness was abrupt and localized, draped directly over my shelter. The wind outside seemed to die down, muffled by whatever was blocking the light. I held my breath. I watched the fabric mere inches from my face. A shape pressed against the outside of the tent. It stretched the taut nylon inward, forming a distinct, three-dimensional impression. It was a hand. It was massive. The fingers splayed wide, pressing down with slow, deliberate force. The scale was wrong. The spread from the thumb to the pinky covered the entire width of my chest. My heart hammered against my ribs. The thin air suddenly felt even thinner. I lay trapped inside the zipped sleeping bag, unable to move my legs, unable to sit up without hitting the roof. I was a captured insect in a silk cocoon. I bargained with the harsh logic of the wilderness. I told myself it was an animal. A starving grizzly bear wandering above the tree line, confused by the scent of my freeze-dried rations. Bears are huge. A paw pressing against the fabric would look like a massive hand. I clung to this explanation. I recited the protocol for encountering predators. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Play dead. A tent is a visual barrier. If the bear does not see a threat, it will move on. The massive impression pressed deeper. The cold nylon brushed against the tip of my nose. I kept my eyes locked on the shape. The fingers were too long, too articulated to belong to an animal paw. The knuckle joints were sharp, rigid under the fabric. I squeezed my eyes shut. I refused to acknowledge the geometry of the shadow. It is a bear, I told myself over and over. A sick, deformed bear. Just let it investigate. Let it smell the nylon and walk away. The pressure remained for an agonizing 10 minutes. The cold seeping through the sleeping bag was intense, but my terror kept me sweating. Every time I shifted my weight, the shadow twitched, reacting to my micro-movements. I stayed perfectly still. I endured the agonizing cramp building in my calf muscles. I endured the burning need for more oxygen. Then, the pressure lifted. The nylon popped back into its curved shape. The shadow slid away, retreating from the roof of the tent. The silver moonlight poured back into the small space. The wind picked back up, howling across the snowpack. I opened my eyes. The ceiling was clear. The shape was gone. I let out a shuddering, broken sigh. The relief was a physical wave washing over me. I had survived. The protocol worked. Remaining still had saved my life. The animal lost interest and wandered back down the mountain. The rational world asserted itself once again. I unclinched my fists. I let my tense muscles relax into the foam sleeping pad. I needed to shift my hips to work out the painful cramp in my leg. I rolled slightly onto my side. I stopped moving entirely as a freezing wet thumb pressed firmly against the base of my spine from inside the zipped sleeping bag. You can outrun what you can see, but the true terror of isolation is realizing your own senses are the cage. If you need something familiar to break the silence, click the video on screen now for 2 hours of creepy night shift stories at the 24-hour laundromat.